So, 1 Corinthians, what do you know about this letter? Boy, there's a great one, Mike. Way to start us out with some foundational information. It was for... Okay. In the first chapter, we deal with division. In fact, is the book of Corinthians on that line a warm, fuzzy, all-positive book? No. In fact, what other issues come up in this book that just might be off the top of your mind? Bob names the first one, divisions dealt with.
Starts out with the greeting at first, introducing with the greeting, but then he goes into talking about division and causing dissent in the church and stuff like that.
Yeah. So what other problems are dealt with? I mean, how about this for a church? And I've used this statement before that church is not a museum of perfect Christians or perfect people, right? It's a hospital for the sick. Corinthians really points this out. How about sexual immorality? Was it the church in Corinth? Yep, you bet it. Everything from living with your mother or stepmother, it's unclear which one, to prostitutes, both heterosexual and homosexual prostitutes, right? What? In the church? Yep, in the church. How about lawsuits? They were suing each other. In the church? Yep, in the church. Disagreements over food are in there. And generally speaking, I guess a better description of that is a worship service. Their worship service is ones that were really demeaning to numerous people, right? It was chaotic, right? Problematic in that way. Problems with spiritual gifts. People using things to elevate themselves, gifts to elevate themselves. And can you believe there are some in the church that didn't even believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Or resurrection of people in general, right? Those are the problems. Sound like church you want to belong to? Sound like a church that you belong to? There's head shaking no, but I disagree. I think that this is one of the great benefits of this book is problems are the same today as they were 2,000 years ago. And denying that, I think, is something that's become very problematic for Christianity as a whole. It's what's giving the impression of holier than thou religion. Holier than thou religion, I mean to say. That there's no problems, in our group. In fact, as we talk about division, we're going to see that one of the common answers today is to outcast, demean, and, basically cast people out, which we're going to see an example of that in Corinth, where that's encouraged. But the very premise of this book is the exact opposite of that. Right? One of the great messages, one of the very, very important messages of this book is this was a church with all these problems. And whose church are they? Christ, yeah. Or it's the first verse we'll get into in a bit. They're church of God, right? They're God's church. And Christ, I think within the first 9 or 10 verses, Jesus or Christ is used no less than 9 times, Mike. So there's a strong emphasis there, which we'll get into in a few moments. I have the subtitle here as A Divided and Troubled Church, right? And these are problems, like I said, that we aren't oblivious to today. Now, there's not a lot of context. I think most of us that are familiar with the Bible understand who Paul is. And Paul's the penman, right? He writes it. And he's really probably the most famous, most well-known apostle because he wrote 13 of the New Testament books. And in other words, he wrote half the New Testament and had a big impact on Mark, who wrote one of the accounts of the gospel. John, Paul is well known. But what I want to look at today is not so much the history of the book. It was probably written in around 52, 53 AD. But something that jumped out at me as I was studying this, and some things that I had never known before, and I'm glad I stumbled across it as I was studying, is the culture and the history, the setting of the city of Corinth. Because unlike most Bibles, you know how a lot of times you can study the setting of a particular city. For instance, there's 7 churches in Asia that we read about in the first 3 chapters of the book Revelation. And they give you little tidbits and you understand why the things being said to them are being said, because you can understand what they manufactured and some of the things they deal with. But the book of Corinth, as I studied about Corinth, really, really brought clarity to me about some of the things that they're dealing with. And so we're going to start there today and look at the idea of Corinth. And by the way, this is a picture of Corinth. This is what's left of the Apollo temple. We'll address a little bit later. And that big mountain there is what made Corinth, one of the things that really made Corinth. That was referred to or called the Acrocorinth, or it means upper Corinth, upper city. And this mountain right here is really a big part of the success of Corinth and what made the city. Questions or comments on?
Chapter 1, as we get down to it, verse 17. That one stumped me for a minute, but as we get to it, we can explain it. Where he said he was sent not to baptize, but to preach. Well, that's part of the preaching, but why he said not to baptize, But I didn't realize that until I read that. I said, why would he say that?
Gotcha. Yeah, we'll certainly deal with that. And I'd say Paul would say that baptizing is a part of preaching.
Yeah.
That's his.
But there he said he not to, and I thought, now why would he say that?
Yeah. So we will certainly, Lord willing, get to that. Bob's excited. He's ready to get into there. All right. What is two of the most important things that are necessary for a city to be successful, especially at this time? Defensible. Good fortification, Bob says. Come back to this picture. This is one of the things that made Corinth so successful. And you can see this is the same picture from Acrocorinth or Upper Corinth, where you see how defensible this city is. In short, what you wanted to do was to make sure that any enemies attacking had come uphill to attack you. Now, Corinth, the whole city was not in this mountain. It didn't have to be in the mountain, right? You're there on the ocean, on the sea. You see ships coming. You know they're going to lay siege to the city. What do? You get uphill, get in fortifications. Incredibly well suited for defending the city. Now, something that's interesting, I don't have a picture of it here, but I found it interesting. There were 2 gates to get into the city of Corinth. And inside the second gate, there was a big iron grate that covered up a tunnel. That tunnel was 5 kilometers long. They tunneled 5 kilometers. Why? Can anyone guess? Yeah, and it wouldn't be so much for escape, but you're on the right concept. When cities were sieged, they were cut off, right? Encircled and cut off from the other world. They would try to store food and things. But bear in mind, they didn't have cell phones, right? Hey, what's going on out there? So 5 kilometer long tunnel was a way to get out, go on the backside, get some supplies if need be, also get information back and forth. Now what's interesting for me, it would be hard to come through a tunnel, but studying history and even Vespasian's attack on Judah, these little passages oftentimes were the downfall of cities, because undoubtedly a traitor would get tired of the siege going on, would slip out and say, hey, I'll show you the secret passage, and bad things always happen out of that. Questions or comments on defensibleness of Corinth? Right there, I think out of the gate we see something, and I want to come back to this. Corinth is the most important city in Greece, and was one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire. When you think of Greece, I know I've already seeded this idea of Corinth, but what city do you think of? Athens, yeah. Corinth was 5 times bigger than Athens. 100,000 people lived in Corinth here. Athens was only about 20,000 people. Plus, as we go throughout this, we're going to see some of the things that really made it so important. What's another thing? So defensibility, what else does it take to have a good... yeah, did you catch on that that's a spring there, Mike? Yeah, well, or spring. This is on top of the mountain, on top of the Acrocorinth, and there's steps. It's not a great picture to show the steps, but there's steps going clear down into there. Some pictures you can find online are drier. People walk way down into it. It's this tremendous water source, and it was really important. But some of the things that really helped Corinth out, and what is really going to play into our study to understand the problems and the advantages that Corinth faced are here. Can you see my cursor up there? Yeah, good. So Corinth is right here. Right where my cursor is. Now we'll zoom in a few moments, but this is something that is going to play into Corinth. It's a cosmopolitan city, meaning it was made up of many different cultures, and one of the most important philosophies of the city was inclusiveness, non-judgmental. It's okay to worship God, just don't say anyone else is wrong with how they worship God. Why would that be? It's a melting pot, we'd call it, right? We've heard that phrase before. Look here, Asia. It's easy, it's central to Asia. Egypt, Judea, Samaria, or Syria, I mean to say. Greece, of course, it's actually part of Greece, although it's a different part or lower part of Greece. Italy, right? It's right in the middle of all those. So there's all these cultures that laid port. It was a port city, right? But here's what's really what made it the isthmus. What's an isthmus? that you, Lisa? Oh,
I should know.
what's
It's not an island.
It's not. It's
It's a,
a land bridge, very close to an island. And Corinth sits right here where the cursor is, and when I move the cursor away, see how narrow that is? 4 miles across there is all it is. So, and I can't remember if my next slide shows this, it does not directly. So, here is the really important part. So you can see that it would be easy to move freight across that 4-mile bridge, right? But here's what really played important. On this side of the peninsula, there was northerly winds, meaning the winds came from the north. Does it make it easy to sail around the peninsula? No. It was very difficult because the winds are against you. Plus, it was an extra 200 miles. Now, the winds here, in the way trade routes came, would be right up these coastlands of modern-day Turkey and then over to Corinth. So the winds are taking you right to Corinth, if you will. But there's even a more important aspect of this land bridge, or this isthmus. Does anyone know where Paul shipwrecked? Malta, which is right over here. Italy, by the way, is right around where I have isthmus on this slide, right? So you can see they would sail through here and then sail across the sea to Italy, go to Rome, and avoid this. Now, one poet of the day I saw quoted numerous times, this speaks to how dangerous it was to sail around the peninsula. He said, if you do it twice, you gotta forget where your home is. Catch on what he's saying? You might get away with it once. You won't do it twice. Now, most scholars today believe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's getting to a point, right? It's very, very dangerous. To me, this gives some context to how dangerous. Remember when there was, 237 souls on board when Paul shipwrecked somewhere thereabouts? Remember the whole time they were saying, hey, guess I silenced my phone. They were saying we ought to stop. You know, it's too dangerous to go on. This is why. Now, as we're talking about melting pot, though, think about this concept. So it's 4 miles across there. Now today, I meant to include a picture. There's a canal there today, right? But that wasn't finished till almost 1900. And it's an impressive canal, right through the mountains, the high sides on it. But this is what they would do. This road was 40 feet wide. And on the side, it had wooden rails. So you could either take your cargo across on big carts to the other side and have another ship on the northern side of the isthmus. Or a lot of ships, they would unload the ship and put the ship on these big carts and push it 4 miles across to the other side and put back in. I think that speaks to how dangerous it was to go around the southern side. It also speaks to this. Not only was Corinth a port city, but people spent time there. The ships had to be unloaded, loaded, right? So people spent a lot of time there. What happens when people have time on their hands? In foreign cities. Yeah, Jamie's got it. Jamie's got it. Not much good, right? You're away from home. People don't recognize you. It was known for its immorality. In fact, there was a phrase, a word that was used at this time to be Corinthicized. wasn't a positive statement. It meant to be very immoral, right? We showed that picture at the beginning of Disney. You know the phrase of Las Vegas. What's Las Vegas's slogan? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. No one says that about Disney, do they? Why is that? Right? It's getting to this concept of Corinth was one of these cities that was known for that. So that is why they're there. I think I had this slide to show from all the different areas I've already covered. Questions or comments on geography? What's an agora? You got it. It's a good thing Jamie showed up today. He'll have help. What's that? Crossword clues. See, I was half expecting someone to point up here, Jamie, and say, one of those. Yeah. It's a marketplace. And Corinth had this huge marketplace. And we're going to go to Acts 18, hopefully before we're done today, as we're really introducing the book, and then, Lord willing, next week we'll get into some things Bob's so excited about. But it was incredible. I think they found 33 bars and taverns, right, in this area. There's so many different markets there. Now, when Paul would come to a new city, what was his custom? Where's the first place he always went? Sorry. Close, the synagogue, right? So he'd go to the synagogue. And in Acts 18, we're going to see he goes there 3 straight weeks on the Sabbath, right? And then where would he go? To the agora, the marketplace, right? Where we could find people. I was speaking to a gospel preacher here a number of months ago, a year or so ago, and I was discouraged by this thought process. He said, Mike, the gospel is just simply not going to spread like it did in the first century. And I'll state this, and I think Corinth will speak to a lot of these elements. For as long as that's the mindset of churches and leadership of churches, it is absolutely correct. It's not going to spread. But here's the reason he gave. He said, I was reading through the book of Acts, and there's always this prepared audience for the speakers. There's always this prepared audience, and they went there, and they had all these people listen to them. And that's just not what we have today. Wow. Talk about focusing on what we don't have. You're right. We don't have agoras, right? We don't have this place. But in a day of mass media, to be resentful that we don't have synagogues and agoras? Really? And what's my point? It's meant to be a positive point. We have the ability to have assembled audiences all over the world without traveling to Corinth and risking shipwreck, right? And all these other problems. The message of the book of Acts in these books and the Agora should be that these people went, you see, there's kind of a difference, isn't it? Paul went not only to Corinth, he went to the synagogue in Corinth, and then he went to the Agora in Corinth. Yet, you see the thought process where he's going versus staying. Very important concepts. So this agora was a central part of the community. It was a place to meet people. Of course, it's Greece, so this is a place where philosophy was debated as well as religions were debated. A place where people go. Name me one place like that today, where people go to discuss and bring forth ideas on philosophy and religion. Gospel meetings? Is there a lot of discussion there? Or are those like-minded people come together to talk? Good thought. Universities would be one, yeah. That would be a really, it happens, right? Good example.
Similar but opposite and opposite views.
Okay, yeah. Good.
And then I think of this as like you hear like sidewalk, or is it sidewalk preachers? Is that what they call them? Mm-hmm. This would probably be something like that. He just went into the marketplace looking for somewhere to start a discussion, started preaching.
Yeah. Well, one significant difference between sidewalk and the agora is people are gathering in the agora for that purpose versus somewhat sidewalk. I'm not saying it always is, but can be almost of an assault where you're engaging people who are not necessarily desiring to be engaged.
For places away from the bar, the 30-some bars that were there. So were they drinking and discussing?
They go hand in hand, don't they? So the agora was many marketplaces, right? And if you look, there's this open, kind of like our malls would be today, open areas in the middle for discussion where people gathered for that purpose. Yeah. I'm going to jump out of here for just a second. See the connection yet? No? Yeah, chatting at the same time. Why are people, is this not a gathering place? It's the absolute purpose of it, isn't it? Is it bigger than Agora? Oh my, yes. Like, way bigger. So you may get, a couple thousand people in Agora. How many people are subscribed to YouTube? You could Google it, more than a couple thousand, right? How many people subscribe to Facebook, TikTok, Instagram? I think we have prepared audiences, don't we? Yeah, it's whether we want to pursue them. And I think that's a really, really important concept to be mindful of versus getting this mind, oh, this is what Paul did. I can't do the same thing today. Right? Questions or comments on the Agora? Okay, so this gets interesting. Let's go to Acts 18 real quick. Because why Acts 18? Someone tell me. This is the founding. The heading, added heading in my Bible is Paul in Corinth. But this is where the church has its. Now, likely had some introduction to Christianity before this because it was a port city, right? Starting in verse 1. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently came from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome and went to see them. So Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome. It seems that it was because they were causing turmoil. It seems that Christianity was at the very root of that concept. So Aquila and Priscilla is there. And Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, and they were tent makers by trade. So Paul looks up at Priscilla and Aquila, and they are in the same trade, which is tent makers. Now, this is interesting because Paul was here during the Isthmian Games. Now, the most important games in the entire world at this time are called what? The Olympics. Yeah, the Olympics. And the second most important games in the world were the Isthmian Games. Now, we explained what isthmus was earlier. It was that bridge. So, Corinth, if I go back a few slides, is on the southern side of this isthmus. Isthmian is on the north side of it. So where do you think that to compete? In tents. Sounds like a pretty good place for a tent maker to gather, huh? Yeah. Paul later is going to say that he was grateful he never took anything from the Corinthians. And we'll discuss that as we go throughout the study. But this is part of what enabled him to do that, right? There's also, so is it chapter 9? Yeah, chapter 9. Paul talks about running the race, right? All these competitors take an oath before the game that they would abide by the rules of the game, and that if not, they would be disqualified. Paul is referencing these exact games to these people. We're very, very familiar with them. By the way, they would win, the ESV I think is a little clearer here, a wreath, right? Paul says the prize. It was a wreath, a crown wreath, made of essentially celery. How long do you think something like that lasts? Not that long before it withers, right? That was the reward for winning. What great illustrations for Paul to illustrate the truths of Christianity, right? So keep that in mind in Isthmian Games when we get to chapter 9. Questions, comments? 36 temples. Now, the one on your right, I want to bring to your mind just 3 of these temples. So that mountain where the Acrocorinth was not just a civic center, it was also a religious center. And bearing in mind that the idea of height had a lot to do with religiosity in their time. You're getting closer to the gods when you ascend. So going up this temple, or going up the mountain, you have temples all along, and then at the top, and what's on your left is what is left of Aphrodite's temple. Aphrodite's is probably the most famous and most important temple in Corinth, to be followed by Apollo's temple. There are 7 pillars left there of the Apollo temple. It was once destroyed, but when it was rebuilt in around 46 AD, it was done so magnificently that any conquerors after that time refused to tear it down or destroy it. That's how impressive it was. It had 36 pillars. It wasn't man that tore them down. It was an earthquake. I think that speaks to how impressive this temple was. Now, Aphrodite, she is the goddess of what? Love, Stephanie says. Or in practicality, sex, right? It's estimated by modern writers of that time that around 1,000, this sits right on top of the mountain, 1,000 prostitutes, both male and female, would work in the temple. Here's what I think we need to wrap our heads around. Prostitution wasn't solely about pleasure. It was seen as a holy rite, something you do for the gods and in service to the gods in these temples. So it wasn't just lawful, it was encouraged, right? That's both heterosexual and homosexual prostitution. 1,000 prostitutes. And it's believed that at the end of the day, at night, they would come down, many of the prostitutes would come down out of the temple of Aphrodite and down into the city for those that couldn't or didn't make it up to the temple. Questions, comments? All right, last point here, and this is an important one. Jamie, just because you've been such a wealth of information, do you know what the bema was? That was a little tougher, right? That's not a word that's used at all. So, a bema is was a judgment seat, if you will. And let's turn very rapidly over to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, if I'm not mistaken. Mike, 2 Corinthians is right after 1 Corinthians, you said, right? Okay, verse 9. So whether we are at home or away, we must make it our aim to please him, for we must all appear before the bema of Christ, the judgment seat of Christ, so each one may receive what is due for what he has done in body, or whether good or evil. If we were to turn back to Acts 18, we would see that Paul is in the city spreading the gospel. There's a riot. They bring him before Gaius, who's sitting on the bema, on the judgment seat, and he says, I don't want to hear about it. So these seats set right next to the agora. They were raised up. They were for observation. Remember, that was the civic center. They could see what's going on. It was for commendation. So in other words, they would bring people here and say, you're a great friend of Rome. Everyone sees it. It's a place to go to. It was also a place for commendation. Condemnation, I mean to say. So putting those two words side by side makes it more difficult. Paul stood there. This is where they took him. They say he's causing problems. Gaius didn't want to have anything to do with it. But this post right here was down on the ground. They'd strip you naked and beat you severely if you were found guilty. The bema. These words that are being used, bema is not the post, it's the judgment seat there. These words that are used, Paul is drawing on what these individuals saw every day. I hope that helps to give some understanding to what we will be looking at in weeks to come. Thank you.